Hey everybody, how's it going? Today I want to show you a project that I've been working on for the past, I don't know, couple of days. But before that, who am I? I'm just a random guy in the internet with 10 plus years of experience. Um, but more importantly, I'm one of those developers that I'm not really happy with the current state of the front end aspect of programming. I think now we have a lot of good tools that we can use. We have made lot of progress, but um, the current state is way too overcomplicated from my point of view. And so let me walk you through the problems that I can relate. And maybe it's just me, but if it makes sense to you, maybe this project could look interesting. And so again, what's the problem that I see in the front end, right? Um, Maybe we can apply this to the back end as well, or to uh, the or to the program end in general. But specifically here, I'm talking about the front end, right? And so in the front end projects, I can see that there's a lot of friction. I've been thinking about this, like what's I can tell that something is wrong in the front end, right? But I'm not quite sure what it is, right? And I think the good word or the well, yeah, I suppose a good word for it would be friction, right? And what do I mean by this? There is a lot of boilerplate code that we have to write before we can tackle the actual problem that we want to solve, right? For instance, if we're working with React, we have to probably, we are dealing with some kind of state, and for that we have to either decide if we want to use hooks or if we want to use contexts, and we have to start passing properties, and you can easily end up with a bunch of files with a bunch of lines of codes that are not really that complicated, are not interesting, but still you need to write those, right? Not only that, we also have a lot of concepts, right? Again, if we're talking about React, we got contexts, we have hooks, we have immutability, we have whatever signals we have. I don't know, right? Do you get the point? There are a lot of concepts that we have to consider, right? And one of the also one of the critical problems that I see is that the current APIs that we're getting exposed to are they're simply not fun to use, right? Some of those APIs can be very verbose to work with, or they're very easy to use incorrectly, which is even worse, right? And I don't want to give any names because I don't want to bash any authors or anything like that, but there are some dependencies where you just simply fall into uh, known issues, right? And you have to be aware of that. And so it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? It should be that you can just use the API without having to worry about it, right? Now, when developing, there's also this problem of performance, right? Since we're dealing with so many files, so many dependencies, some of the APIs, the typing when we're using TypeScript, they can be a bit ridiculous or maybe too extreme, right? And because of that, we end up with a very poor experience, right? Probably you have faced the issue where you wanna see what functions you have in a particular file, and the autocomplete is taking a while, right? Or sometimes editor the editor just gives up, right? And that's because of this. That is uh, one of the reasons why TypeScript is now being rewritten in Golang. It's because we're taking it to the extreme, and we can start seeing some performance problems. But I don't think that's uh, that's a good problem to solve. I don't know, maybe, but it looks like we're using the tools in an incorrect way, right? If we were to simplify the whole thing, everything would be way better, right? Now, the next problem is deployment, especially when we're talking about single page applications, where if you think about it, the deployment should be just a matter of copying some public folder and pasting in some service such as S3, for instance. That's it, right? It's something that the client can just download, um, open up an HTML file, and that's pretty much it, right? And so probably I'm missing some other problems as well, or friction points, but we can more or less see how perhaps we're just overcomplicating the problem, right? If you think about it, what's the problem that we're dealing with in the front end? We just need to update some state uh, and then draw an interface based on that. And then, of course, we also have to consider events such as clicks, um, user inputting some data, so on and so forth. But that's pretty much it, right? So it kind of looks like we're just making a mess out of a what it looks to be a very simple problem. And so what if we could just have the um, the state of the application as a global variable, right? So we don't need to use special functions in order to update the state. Wouldn't that be nice, right? We don't have to deal with context or um, any other special uh, concept, right? We could just update a global variable and that's it. The UI is gonna render again, right? Also, this may look a bit controversial. This could start a little bit of controversy, but what if we could import all the files that we're going to be using in just one place, right? Instead of having to deal with imports in every single file. Wouldn't that be nice? Like, I know that most of the imports are being auto-completed automatically by the editor, but still, wouldn't it be nice that we don't even need that, right? We could just use the function and that's it. Um, Also, what if we simplify the problem by just drawing the interface um, every amount of milliseconds, right? You could say, well, isn't that wouldn't that give us a poor performance or heavy consumption of resources? I don't know. Maybe it's something that we should revisit. I mean, we have to consider that now we have very powerful devices, computers, phones, etc. Right? So maybe this is not really a problem. Um, Also, what if we had some opinions, some hard opinions, some defaults? And what I mean by this is, what if we stop trying to make everything so extensible? what if we just um, consider that our application is going to have some, how can I say this better? Um, we know what are the features that we can expect from pages, right? Every page has navigation, every page has perhaps um, a login form, registration. Um, we also, it would be good to say, well, every time that I navigate away from a page, I want to cancel some of the requests that I made while I was on that page, right? Isn't that like a common case, right? That we face um, constantly, but still we have to write that every single time. And why, right? It's something that you could expect from every single application, right? Um, and also, wouldn't it be nice that we could share code with the front end and the back end? And this is specifically for, well, you could imagine sharing the same validation logic for forms, right? When you want to submit or create a new resource, maybe update a user or something like that, you usually have the same logic for validating those inputs, right? Wouldn't that be nice to be able to just share functions between the front end and the back end without having to do any special uh, or without having to have any special treatment for it? Um, Also, having no compilation or build step is so good. Um, but at the same time, working with just JavaScript, I mean, JavaScript is a super flexible language, right? But that flexibility sometimes can be a con, right? And so, what if we could have just a little bit of TypeScript, but still without needing some build step or compilation step or nothing like that? Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't it be nice that you could just double click and index that HTML file and you can see your code running? That would be great, right? And also that would open the possibility of deploying the front end by just dropping a public folder, right, into an S3 service like I mentioned before, right? And so this is the problems that I see in the front end, and the the project that I want to show you here. I've written and excuse me, I've created this project considering all of those problems, right? And more importantly, considering what would it be nice to find, right? And so let me go ahead and show you how it looks, right? First of all, let's begin by the index file, the HTML. This is my approach of how to deal with imports, right? You could say, whoa, this is like we just went back in time. What's going on? But in practice, this is super handy, right? I don't have to import files within the JavaScript, and also we could take advantage of caching, right? If I made a change in my application, right? Let's say that I only updated components, the rest of the files are going to be cached, right? And so the user wouldn't have to download the whole thing, right? Um, that's one thing. Now let's go ahead and inspect the main file, if you will, right? Now, like I mentioned previously, I would like to have the state in a global variable. I don't want to have to deal with special functions, nothing like that. I just want a global variable that if I update it, the UI is gonna um, get updated as well, right? Without me having to do anything, right? So this is how I'm dealing with state in this project. It's again just a single global variable, nothing special, right? And so for this demo, I want to focus on these fields, right? You can see here we got some username, some password, and some value, right? Super simple. Now let's go ahead and ignore this for now. Let's ignore this. And in here, we can see that this function called app is going to be the first one to be called, right? In here, since we don't have any page assigned, we're going to render or we're going to draw this demo page component, right? So let's go ahead and inspect what that component looks like, right? And so in here, you can see that the component itself is drawing or rendering the username directly from the state, from the global variable, right? We don't have to do, again, we don't have to do anything. We just use functions and global state. That's the whole premise of this, right? We can do the same for the password. We can do the same for the value, right? And now what if we want to update this, what if we want to update the state based on some actions, such as the user clicking on a button? Well, we could just do that. We can just draw a button, and when the user clicks on the button, we're going to update the state. That's it. Super simple, super straightforward. No additional concepts, nothing like that, right? What if we have perhaps some asynchronous action, right? What if we want to update, I don't know, the username after 1 second? Well, we could pretty much do the same. Uh, we can draw the button, and when the user clicks on the button, we're going to call this function. Let's see what this function does. We can see that, again, it's a super simple function, nothing special, right? It is an asynchronous function that is going to sleep for some milliseconds, and then it's going to just update the state. Now, what is this sleep for? Well, this is just a helper function that I wrote, but it's basically a set timeout wrapped in a promise, as you can see here. And I'm gonna walk you through the global this later on. But for now, the sleep for again is just set timeout, but in a promise. Super simple. What if we got an input, right? Something that it's very common in applications, and we want to update the state based on the user's input. Again, we just draw the input, and then on the event, we just update the state. And if we want to show the value of that state, we just do so, right? Super simple. What if we want to perhaps we have some shared components, such as links, modals, things like that? Well, those are simple functions that return the HTML as string, like the component that we're seeing here, right? This demo page is a component. And what is a component? It's just a function that returns the HTML that we want to render, that we want to draw, right? If we inspect this link component, we can see that it is a super simple component. It's just an A tag with the with the link attribute assigned. Now let's see how this looks in the browser. If we reload the page, we can see that this is, like I mentioned, a simple index file, HTML file, that you can just open in the browser. You don't need to do anything extra. And in here we can see how the username is being rendered straight from the state, the same for the password and the same for the value. What if we click some buttons? You can see how the username got updated. What if we click this other button? We wait for 1 second and voila, the username got updated. What if we type something? Everything seems to work out of the box. What if we update the state straight from the console? Or even better, what if I want to see the state, right? Super useful for debugging sessions, right? We can see the username is something. Well, what if we update the username to Franco? And you can see that it works out of the box, super simple, nothing special. So how am I doing this, right? Are we am I working with signals? What is the deal? Nope. It is super simple. If we open up the render file, this is pretty much it. And so what we're doing is we're drawing the HTML to the file every X amount of milliseconds. That's it. Now frame ms, right? I want to render 60 frames per second, right? And so basically the flow goes as draw the UI, wait for a little bit, render again. That's it. And render is gonna make sure to call the app function. The app function that we got right here, right? And this app function is gonna render the page, the correct page, right? In this case, since we don't have anything assigned, we're gonna render demo page, and demo page is gonna render the HTML that we want to render, that we want to draw in the HTML. So again, it's super simple. So I've been working with this, like I said, for a few days. I can also show you a more complicated page, as you can see here, which is just a demo checkout page where we got some email validation. As you can see here, we got this is a super basic validation, right? But you can see how this everything works out of the box. We also have some basic input masking. So in here, if I type whatever, nothing happens. But as soon as I type two numbers like 1, 2, you can see an additional slash shows up and it updates the cursor to the last position so that I can type the year, right? And as you can see, it's a very straightforward um, form with some mocked requests that, for instance, this billing address, these fields are interesting because if one of these fields is not valid, the shipping options won't show up, right? Shipping options is a mocked API that will give you some options, some shipping options based on your billing address. But in order to show that, we need a valid billing address, right? And so when I type, you can see how this gets called, and now we render the shipping options, right? And as you can see, there is a little bit of complexity here, not that much, but there is a little bit, and you can see that this just works just fine, and we don't see any performance problems, right? Um, of course, this is a very simple demo slash page, and I would like to create more complicated demos to see if we hit some performance wall. I I don't think that's gonna be the case, but it's better to be sure, right? We also have some register page. As you can see, the navigation works just fine. We got some very simple form in here, right? or I can submit, but if I do so, you can see how it's mocking some API consumption, and now I'm registered, right? Also, we can navigate to a jokes page, which is just a funny page that it will simulate or implement infinite scrolling, right? You can see that if I clear the console, if I scroll down, as soon as as the red div is in viewport, it's going to ask for new jokes, right? As you can see. Let's see how this gets implemented. Go ahead and close some of the files. Let's open up the jokes file. As you can see, we get a function to return the default uh, state for this page, right? Which is super simple. It's just a list of jokes and some status for a when we request the jokes, right? This is a function that's gonna be called automatically by the library every time we navigate to the page, right? And so this is super simple. We're just updating the current page to be jokes, right? And if we remember, the app component is going to look for that variable to see which page should we render, right? And so basically when we navigate to the jokes page, which we assigned in here, right? We're going to call this jokes init function. This jokes init function is going to update the page field, and then based on that page the application will know which component to render, right? Super simple. Now, let's see what do we render, right? In the jokes page, we're just drawing all the jokes that we have in the state, as you can see, right? We go through all the jokes and then we render a div. If we're requesting a joke, we're going to show a small loading message. And then this is the div that I'm using for in order to tell if I should ask for more jokes, right? And you can see how I've included a new, this is a custom built attribute, right? Which sadly we don't have this implemented natively in the browser, right? But nonetheless, I just went ahead and implemented it. And you can see that when this component or this element gets in the viewport, it's gonna call this function. And if we go to the function, we could see that it's super simple. If we are already requesting a joke, we don't do anything. But if we're not, we're gonna just update the state of the request to be pending. We're gonna ask for the joke itself, and then once we get the joke, we're gonna add it to the list, right? If for some reason there's a problem, we're gonna set this. This is wrong. We're gonna set the request to fail, which it doesn't do anything, but just to illustrate for illustrative purposes, right? And then if we inspect add jokes, right, we're gonna just add the new joke into the list of jokes. Super, super simple. Now, let let me show you a little bit of the registration um, page. And this is a well, none of the demos are particularly interesting or mind-blowing, right? What I want to show with this is that we could be dealing with this problem in a very simple way, right? So simple that it kind of looks boring, right? But for some reason, we're swimming in this ocean of complexity and dependencies and files and whatever, right? Now, but this one, this registration is a bit special because it shares code with the backend, if you will, right? And so in here you can see that I have a super simple dummy backend. I'm still working on it, but this server is gonna run using Node.js, right? Now, the interesting thing is that the backend and the front end, they both share the same logic to validate new users, the registration of new users, right? And how do we do that? Well, first of all, you can see that we're starting to see some patterns or some repetition, right? Where we have a function that returns the initial or the default state for this page, right? In this case, we're just returning some fields and some errors, right? Then we got the callback whenever we navigate into this page, right? And then some very basic functions to update the state based on some events, right? This one is going to be updating the username and then it's going to run some validation, right? Now, and this is pretty much the same. And then we got some submit, right? Now, let me go ahead and collapse this. I want to show you the render, right? In here, the page is going to render the registration form. And then in here, we got some share components, right? For instance, the link, text field, so on and so forth, right? But there's nothing special about it, right? It's pretty much the same. When we got an event, we just call a function which is going to update the global state, right? But now, where, and as you can see, we got some errors here, but where do we calculate those errors, right? How do we know that? Because we don't have anything in here, right? We're just calling some user validate confirm password, right? Or user validate password. And if we go to the registration page, we can see that the validation is in fact working, right? We can see the messages, so on and so forth. And so what are those functions? Well, this is where sharing code with the backend comes in place. Inside of public in the shared folder, we got this user file, which is going to have some functions. Never mind this. You could just ignore this. This is just a way of allowing the front end and the back end to be using the same code pretty much, right? And so you can see how we're having this function that we can use in the front end and in the back end. And in here, we see the validation functions, right? Which is super uh, useful because any change that you do in here is going to be reflected both in the backend and in the front end, which is exactly what you want, right? You don't want to have to be updating to this validation in two places, right? In here, you can see how we're validating the username. We're saying, well, it needs to be present. If it is present, we don't add any message, but if it's not, we're gonna show this message. Um, we want to check for the user's name length, right? We want to say, well, at least 2 and 10 characters is good, right? If it is, we don't show anything, but if it's not, if it doesn't pass that validation, we're gonna add this message, right? And then we filter this array of errors using the Boolean function, which is pretty much gonna get rid of these empty messages, right? And so basically what I'm saying here is that if the username is not valid, we're gonna end up with error message 1, error message 2, so on and so forth, right? But if the if the username is valid, we're gonna end up with empty strings, and then if we filter those empty strings, right, we're gonna end up with an empty array, right? And with this we can tell, oh, we don't have any errors. It must be because the username is valid, right? And you can see some the pattern in here, right? It's pretty much that. So this is super interesting because again we can use this validation logic in the front end, as you can see here, we're validating the user inputs, right? If it's not valid, we're not gonna do anything when submitting the form. But if it is valid, we're gonna, well, set this flag to true, and then we're gonna do some processing, right? In this case, we're just mocking some API call. Now, how does this code look like in the backend, right? So for that, again, like I said, this is a super bare bones server, and in here we're gonna, for every request, we're gonna just call this function, right? And so the interesting thing, the interesting code is inside here, and so let's go ahead and open up, right? So imagine we're trying to create a new user from the registration form, right? And we're sharing the same fields as we're seeing in the front end, right? Here, if I hover over the user, we can see we got username, password, and confirm password, right? And then if I hover into errors, we can see the same username, errors, username, password, confirm password, and these are gonna contain the list of error messages that each field could have, right? And if it's not valid, we're gonna just um, throw the errors, right, which we could later handle in a catch block. But if it's valid, well, probably we're gonna create the entry in the database, right? But as you can see, this is super, super interesting. We got the same, literally the same code running in the front end and in the back end. And the cool thing is that we're doing so without doing any special treatment, right? We're just calling functions. Um, it's as simple as that, right? Now, one last thing that I want to show you, probably I'm missing some details, but one thing that I want to show you and is that let's go to the app file, right? Or perhaps which one do I want to? Let's go to this one. One thing that I want to show you is that why am I setting some default fields such as this one? We're in the checkout page. This is the checkout state, which is going to return the default state for this page. But why am I doing this? Why am I setting these default values to each field? You can see that I'm doing this even for some errors, right? I'm just putting some empty array of strings or maybe the items as you can see here, promotions. Why am I doing that? Well, this is because um, of the point that I was mentioning about using TypeScript only so slightly. In here, because I'm using these defaults, I can see if I hover over the function, I can see that this function is going to return an object containing all of these fields, and out of the box without having to use explicitly, without having to use TypeScript, I still have some autocomplete and some documentation, which is super, super helpful, right? That is the whole reason for it. And the cool thing is that, again, I have all of this documentation, this autocomplete, this tooling, without having to compile the code from TypeScript back to JavaScript, right? And if you check the code, you can see that I'm doing that in pretty much all my files. And so with this, you can tell, oh, isURL, for instance, takes a value which is it must be a string, right? The same for number, the same for is positive, so on and so forth, right? I can tell you exactly what are the parameters that I'm taking and what I'm returning because I'm using these default values. And so yeah, that's pretty much the project. I hope you could. I hope this was useful. As you can see, yeah, perhaps it would be best if you navigate the code from the GitHub repository, which I'm gonna leave down in the comments. But hopefully this was useful to you, and if you got any comments, I would highly appreciate it. Um, Hopefully you share some of the problems that I've talked about in here, and if you consider the solution is good enough, I would be very happy if you could give me some comments, or perhaps if you could use it in your next project. In any case, that's pretty much it, and yeah, thank you for watching, and have a good day. Bye.